Hey Cheva, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Beis of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 72. Today there's not really some juicy stuff over here today. There's talking about kind of like different views on the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about whether or not you can rely on your shitufim mevos for your Ayruvin Chatzeris. And then we get into a new Mishnah about these people who are spending Shabbos in like a mansion. These groups of people who are spending Shabbos in a mansion. How do they contribute their bread to the Chatzer in which the mansion is? Well, that's what we're talking about today. So, let's go weiter. Where should we start? Alright, I'll take a vote. Where do you guys want to start? I think maybe the most sense would be to start about 10 lines from the bottom of Ayin Aleph Mud Beis. My Reb Meir my Rabbanan. So yesterday we had mentioned at the end that there was machlokas between Reb Meir and the Rabbanan about can you be mishtate? Can the shitufei mevos work for Eruve Chatzeris or not, right? If you make a shitufei mevos, do you also have to make an Eruve Chatzeris? So here is the brisa in which it talks about, and I think we mentioned it at the end of yesterday as well, but it's a good place for us to begin. My Reb Meir my Rabbanan, what is the opinion of Reb Meir? What is the opinion of the rabbis? The Tanya is, we learn in the brisa, Ayruvin b'chatzeres bepas. So you can, so in a chotzer, so you make an eruv with bread, right? Because eruv is about where you are for Shabbos, and it's and where a person considers himself to be is where his food is, and that's going to be bread. But you don't make a eruv with wine. You can make a shitufei mevos with wine. And if you want to use bread for your shitufei mevos, that would work as well. It's no problem. Right? Even though you make an Eruv Chatzeris, you still have to do a shitufei mevos. Probably the other way around. Even though you did a shitufei mevos, you still have to do an Eruv Chatzeris lishkach toras eruv min hatinokos, so that the children will not forget about the hilchos Ayruvin, that you make eruvs in the chatzers. Sheyomu avosenu lo ervu divrei Meir. Reb Meir is concerned that if we would rely solely on the shitufei mevos that we do and do not do eruvei chatzeros as well, then the children might think that their parents didn't actually do eruvei chatzeros bichlal, and they'll forget about eruvei chatzeros. The Chachamim say that it's enough. If you do a shitufei mevos, then it can work for the eruvei chatzeros as well. Pligi ba Rabbi Rachumi v'Rabba Bar Yosef, that the Agaus Habach changes the Amoraim here to Rabbi Rachumi and Rabba Bar Yosef. Chad Omer b'pas d'chuli amalo plige b'chad osage. So one opinion is that when it comes to bread, everyone agrees, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Meir, everyone agrees that when it comes to bread, if you do a shitufei mevos with bread, you don't have to do an eruvei chatzeris. Ki plige, where do they argue? B'yayin. When it comes to wine, that Reb Meir says that if you do a shitufei mevos with wine, then you would have to do an eruvei chatzeris. However, the Chacham say that if you do a shitufei mevos with wine, you would not have to do an eruvei chatzeris. V'chad Amar, the other way to understand the machlokas between Reb Meir and the Chachamim is b'yayin d'chuli amalo pligi debein antarte. That when it comes to wine, if you make a shitufei mevos with wine, certainly you're going to have to do an eruvei chatzeris. Ki plige bepas. The machlokas, however, is when it comes to bread. If you make a shitufei mevos with bread, will that cover the eruvei chatzeris as well? Meisvei, we have a question. The Chachamim say, right? This is in this brisa that we just quoted. V'chachamim omrim, o me'arvin o mishtatfin, that either you make an eruv or you make a shituf. Ma'ila. What it means is, O me'arvin b'chatzer b'pas, O mishtatvin b'mavi b'yayin. So, what we want to say is what it means. What does it mean, O me'arvin, O mishtatvin? It means either you make an eruv in the chatzer with bread, or you can make a shitufei mevos with wine, and that will work for the chatzer as well. So therefore, that would be a problem for the second version of the Machlokes between Reb Meir and the Chacham, which said that everyone agrees that wine would not work. But we want to argue that what the Brisa is saying is that if you make a shitufei mevos with wine, that would work for the Chatzar as well. So Amar of Gidol Amar Rab, says of Gidol in the name of Rab, no, Hachi Kamar. This is what the Brisa is saying. It's not saying that, either you can make an Eruv with bread and that, and that works for Eruv and bread. It would also work for a shitufei mevos, and that you can make a shitufei mevos with wine and that would cover your Eruv Chatzeros. That is not what it's saying. What it's saying is, according to Rav Gidol Amar Rab, O me'arvin b'chatzer b'pas u'mutarin kan v'chan, O mishtatzvin b'mavi b'pas u'mutarin kan v'chan. So says Rav Gidol Amar Rab, what the Bryce over here is saying is that if you can make an Eruv with bread, and that works, right? An Eruv, bread works for both the Eruv and the Shituf. Or you can make a shitufei mevos with bread, and it will work for the shituf as well as the Eruv. Now, I think that what this means, if I looked it up in the art school also, because all these different configurations of bread and wine and mavos and chatzers can get a little bit confusing. And what I understand from the art school is that it's not saying that if you make an eruvei chatzeros with bread, it will also work for the shitufei mevos. It doesn't work that way. But what it's saying is that you can use bread for eruvei chatzeros and you can use bread for shitufei mevos. However, if you were to only make a shitufei mevos and you used bread for the shitufei mevos, then you would not have to make an eruvei chatzeros. It would cover your eruvei chatzeros, right? So the point is that bread can work in the context of eruv, and it works in the context of shituf as well. But if you only made an eruv with bread, you would still have to make a shitufei mevos. But if you only made a shitufei mevos, you wouldn't have to make an eruv. That's the way I understand it. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav halacha Reb Meir. So it says Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav that the halacha is like Reb Meir. Rav Huna Amar minig Reb Meir. Reb Yochanan Amar nagua Reb Meir. Right? We've seen this a few times. Right? That halacha means that you would mamish tell everybody, you would tell in public that the halacha is like Reb Meir. Whereas Rav Huna says that the minig is like Reb Meir, meaning we wouldn't publicly tell like a big shear of a lot of people that the halacha is like Reb Meir. But if somebody asks a shaila, we'd be happy to tell them that the halacha is like Reb Meir. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that the minig is like Reb Meir, that we wouldn't even recommend that people do like Reb Meir. However, if somebody did like Reb Meir, so then that would it would be acceptable. That would be fine. Reb Meir's opinion being that you would have to do both shitufei mevos and an eruvei chatzeros, which I guess sounds like that. Well, I don't know what it sounds like. It depends, I guess, if you hold if it's halach or a minig or a noagan. Fine. Well, I guess if you say noagu, right, then it sounds like. So then what that means is that we wouldn't paskin that the halacha is like Reb Meir, meaning we would paskin that if somebody came to ask a shaila, we would say that if you make a shitufei mevos, it works for the eruvei chatzeros as well. But if you made both, then beseder. I don't know. I think. Fine. New Mishnah. Chamisha chaburis sheshavsu betraklin echod. So if you had 5 groups that are spending Shabbos in a mansion, okay. So it's basically you have this chutzner. Now in this chutzner, there's a few buildings. One of the buildings is this mansion that we're talking about. Now, in this mansion, it's really just one big room. And there are 5 doors. And you can enter into this big room by any of the 5 doors. And then there's some kind of partition between the 5 sections. So it's not really quite like a hotel per se, where like there's mamish different suites or whatever. It's really just one big room with 4 partitions to separate out 5 areas, right? Meaning 5 areas that have 4 partitions between them, right? Because when you have 5 areas, there's going to be 4 things in between. So, fine. So that's what we're talking about. Some kind of big room of sorts that we're calling a mansion. And it's 5 doors that go into this really big room. And in the room, there's like 5 sections where people could hang out for Shabbos. So we have these 5 groups that are spending Shabbos in this mansion. Now this mansion is part of a chutzner. And the chutzner has a number of units in it, and therefore there's going to have to be, right, this mansion is going to have to participate in the, well, not have to, but people are going to want to carry in the chutzner, so they're going to participate in this in this Ayruvin Chatzeros with the rest of the buildings over there. The question is, what is their responsibility towards the Chatzer? How much bread do they have to contribute? Does each group have to contribute bread, or maybe only one group has to contribute for everybody? So, says the Mishnah, Chamisha Chaburis Sheshavzu B'Traklin Echad. If you have 5 groups that are spending Shabbos together in this mansion, Beis Shammai Omim Eruv L'Chol Chabur V'Chabur. So Beis Shammai says that every single group is going to have to supply a loaf of bread to contribute to the Eruv of the Chatzar with the other buildings. Beis Hillel Omim Eruv Echad L'Chulan. Whereas Beis Hillel says, no, they can just, all 5 groups can together come up with one loaf of bread, which they will contribute to the communal Eruv. Umodim, however, Beis Hillel agrees that that if, like, they're in different rooms and lofts, well, then in that case, they will need to provide, each group will have to provide their own bread, right? And we're basically going to spend the rest of the daf explaining what exactly, or at least until the next Mishnah, what exactly is the configuration of this room with all of these walls. How much of a wall was it? How much of a divide was there between the different groups of a separation? Says the Gemara, Amr Rav Nachman, Machlogas b'mesipas, ava b'mechitza asar divrei hakol erev l'chol chabur v'chabur. So says Rav Nachman that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is by mesipas. Who could tell me what a mesipas is? A mesipas is like some little separation, less than 10 tfachim, made up of like pieces of wood, right? So some kind of pretty makeshift separation between the different areas, okay? So that is where there's a machlokas. That in that case, Beis Hillel says that, look, because there's no significant divider, so the whole group really just has to come up with one bread for everyone. Aval b'mechitza asara. But if the divider was 10 tfachim tall or more, well then then everyone would agree that that's already a significant divider, and it's 5 separate groups, 5 distinct groups, and they're each going to have to produce a loaf of bread. Ikeda Amri, there are those who say, Amr Rav Nachman, said Rav Nachman, Av b'mesipas, even by a mesipas, machlokas. Wait, what? Yes. Right, Amr Rav Nachman, right, Ikeda Amri, Amr Rav Nachman, Af b'mesipas machlokas. Right, there are those who say that Rav Nachman says that even by a mesipas is machlokas, meaning that there's a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel when the divider is taller than 10 tfachim, that still Beis Hillel says that they would only have to produce one bread from everybody, meaning a total of one bread. Now, according to this opinion of Rav Nachman, the machlokas extends then also to when it's lower than 10 tfachim, that even when it's lower than 10 tfachim, Beis Shammai would still say that everyone needs to produce their own loaf of bread. Pligei bar Reb Chia, Reb Shimon Rebbe. So now we add another 2 opinions to the mix of where this machlokas could be. Chad Omer machlokas b'mechitzas hamagias l'tikra. One of the opinions, either Reb Chia or Reb Shimon Rebbe, one of their opinions is that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is when the divider reaches the ceiling, goes all the way up to the ceiling. Beis Hillel nonetheless says that they would only have to produce one bread from a total of one bread from everybody. But if the dividers do not reach the ceiling, well then even Beis Shammai would agree, everyone would agree that you only have to come up with one bread from everybody, one bread total. The other opinion is machlokas b'mechitzes she'ein magios l'tikra, that the machlokas is davka when the walls do not reach the ceiling. That is where Beis Hillel says that you can produce one loaf of bread for total of one for everybody. But if the walls reach the ceiling, well then even Beis Hillel would admit that each individual group would have to produce an Eruv, a bread to contribute to the Eruv. Meisve, we have a kasha. Amr Rabbi Yehuda Hasabar, says Rabbi Yehuda Hasabar. Rashi says that his name is Hasabar al Shem Churfe Karidehachi, like he was very sharp, so they call him the Sabar, maybe like a lightsaber. But Mistama Sabar probably comes from Svara, from he was very good. He's very sharp. So says Rabbi Yehuda Hasabar, Lo nechlku beishamai uvesilal. Everyone agrees. Beishamai and Beisil both agree that if the walls reach the ceiling, well then each group would have to produce their own loaf of bread to contribute to the communal Eruv. Alma nechleku, where's the machlokas? Ha-mechitzes she'ein magios latikra. It's when the walls do not reach the ceiling. Shebeis Shammai omrim Eruv l'chol chabura v'chabura. The Beis Shammai says that nonetheless, everyone would have to produce their own loaf of bread. But Beisil would say that since the walls do not reach the ceiling, you can just produce one bread total for everybody. Whoa, what just happened? I just skipped. Oh no, I didn't skip. So according to the Manda Amar, right, this was one, we don't know if it was Reb Chia or Reb Shimon Rebbe, but this was one of their two opinions, which is that the machlokes is when the walls reach the ceiling, right? So, but if the walls do not reach the ceiling, then everybody agrees that you'd only have to produce one loaf of bread. Well, this is clearly arguing on that, because this is saying that when the walls reach the ceiling, everyone would say that each group would have to bring a loaf of bread. But if the walls don't reach the ceiling, that's where there's a machlokas. So this is clearly going to be a kasha for the one who says that the machlokas is when the walls reach the ceiling. And according to the opinion who says that when the walls do not reach the ceiling, that is where the machlokas. Well, perfect. Score. Siyata. This is a proof. This is a support. La'achlishna da Amr Rav Nachman. Now, Rav Nachman also had two takes on what this machlokas can be. So, according to the opinion of Rav Nachman, according to the version of Rav Nachman, that machlokas b'mesipas, that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is when you have a dinky little wall that's not even 10 tefachim, but if it's 10 tefachim or taller, even Beis Hillel would agree that each group would have to produce a bread. Well, tiyufta, it's going to be a kasha, because this mechitza, by definition, a mechitza is 10 tefachim. So this is larger than 10 tefachim, and this brisa is saying that it's machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So it's going to be a problem for that first version of Rav Nachman. But Ella, la'achlishna da Amr Rav Nachman, but according to the version of Rav Nachman, that af b'mesipas machlokas, that there is even a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel when it comes to this dinky wall that's less than 10 tefachim, this dinky little divider that's less than 10 tefachim, but it's also a machlokas when it's larger than 10 tefachim. Well, le'matava tiyufta doesn't necessarily have to be a kasha on Rav Nachman, because maybe Rabbi Yehuda Sabar would agree with him. Rabbi Yehuda Sabar is saying that when the walls do not reach the ceiling, there's a machlokas. So, i.e., when you have a wall that's 10 tefachim tall that doesn't reach the ceiling, there's a machlokas. Okay, Rav Nachman would agree with that. The chiddush of Rav Nachman is that he says that the machlokas is also even when it's not 10 tefachim. The question is, would Rabbi Yehuda Sabar agree with that? So, Amalek Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman would say to you, plige b'mechitzav v'adim b'mesipas, that actually the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is when it's a mechitza, when it's 10 tefachim tall, but also when it is lower than 10 tefachim, and some Rabbi Yehuda Sabar would agree with that as well. That's what Rav Nachman would argue. Well, then why is Rabbi Yehuda Sabar Davka talking about when the wall is larger than 10 tefachim, if they also, after all, argue when it's lower than 10 tefachim? To tell you the extremity of Beis Hillel's opinion that even when the wall is higher than 10 tefachim, they still say that they would only have to produce one Eruv for the entire group, for all 5. One Eruv total. But one second, why do we have to say that this Bryce is talking about where the wall is taller than 10 tefachim to show how lenient Beis Hillel is? Why don't we say that why doesn't the Bryce say that the machlokas is dafka when it's lower than 10 tefachim to teach how stringent Beis Shammai are, that even when it's lower than 10 tefachim, they still say that each group has to produce their own loaf of bread. So the Gemara answers, koach de'atera adif, because the strength of permitting something is preferable. And there's a really cool Rashi over here, the Likutei Rashi from Masechta Beitza, which is really cool. I think I always remembered this conceptually, but always forgot where it was. And I think this is actually what I was thinking of. And Rashi explains it very nicely. He says, Tov lo lashmi'enu koach divrei amatir. It's much more preferable for us to tell us the opinion of the one who says that something is permissible. Shehu somech al shmu'aso, because he's relying on his wisdom, he's relying on his knowledge, on his learning. Ve'enu yari lahatir, and he's not scared to say that something is permissible. Aval koach ha'osrin, but the strength of somebody who just is a naysayer, eina raya, is not really much of a proof. Everybody can be strict. You can even say that something that's permissible is forbidden. Right? It doesn't take any great wisdom to say that something is not allowed. But to say something that's permissible, well, then you really have to have confidence, and you really have to be able to rely on your knowledge. So therefore, so we're going to answer that the reason that it was preferable to teach that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is when the wall is larger than 10 tefachim, is taller than 10 tefachim, and to teach us that even there Beis Hillel says that still you'd only have to bring a total of 1 loaf of bread from all the groups. Amar of Nachman, Amar Rav, halacha Rabbi Yehuda Asabar, says of Nachman name of Rav that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda Asabar. Okay, that everyone agrees that when the wall reaches the ceiling, there's no machlokas, that you would have to bring 5 loaves of bread, but that the machlokas is when the wall does not reach the ceiling. Fine. Amr of Nachman bar Yitzchak, says of Nachman bar Yitzchak, masnisin nami deka, and you can also infer this from our Mishnah. How? The Katani, as it says, umodim, that Beis Hillel agree, bizman shemiktasan shruim b'chadorim v'aliyas shetzrichen erev l'chol chabura v'chabura, that Beis Hillel agree that when some of the groups are in like separate areas of the mansion, in separate rooms or lofts, shetzrichen erev l'chol chabura v'chabura, well then every single, each group is going to have to bring contribute a bread to the communal erev of the chatzar. My chadarim umay aliyas. Now, what are these separate rooms and like upper levels? If you're going to say that these rooms are mamish rooms and these lofts are mamish lofts, well, pshita, obviously they would have to bring their own breads. They're in a whole separate area. Elalav, no, the chiddush is that ke'ein chadarim u'che'ein aliyos. No, it's talking about a setup which is like separate rooms and like separate levels. Umayniu mechitos amagios letirka shmamina. It's talking about these partitions that reach the ceiling. That I guess it's not exactly the same quality as like mamish separate rooms, but but it would be enough to say that that even Beis Hillel would agree that each group would have to contribute a separate loaf of bread. Tana, we learn in a brayso b'medumar mamurim. When do Beis Shammai say that each group has to contribute a loaf of bread? K'shemolichen es Ayruvin l'makom acher. When they are bringing their Eruv to a different place. So meaning, we have this chutzner. In the chutzner, there are a number of buildings. One of those buildings is the mansion. Now, this mansion, the people who are spending Shabbos there want to contribute in the Eruv or to the Eruv of the chutzner. So Beis Shammai says, well, if they're bringing their bread to one of the other buildings in the chutzner, well, then yes, each group is going to contribute their own bread. Aval. But if the Eruv was being placed in the mansion, that all the other buildings were going to bring bread and put it in the mansion, well then, even Beis Shammai would agree that mansion would only need to contribute a total of one bread. Kiman azla hadetanya, like whom does the following brisa go like? Chamisha shegavu es Ayruvin, that if you have 5 people in a chutzner, right? So you have 5. Imagine you have 2 chutzers that are right next to each other. Each chutzner has 5 houses in it, and there's a doorway in between them, and they want to make an eruv between the 2 of them, so they can carry between the different chutzers. So if one of the chutzers made an eruv, all 5 houses contributed bread. Well then, when they're going to bring their eruv to the other chutzner, so that they can make an eruv chatzeres, eruv echad lechulan. So you would only have to bring 1 loaf of bread for all 5 of the houses, right? So all of the 5 houses contributed to the eruv of that one chutzner, but then they would only have to bring 1 bread into the other chutzner to make the eruv between the 2 chutzers. So Kiman, who is that like? Beis Hillel. It's like Beis Hillel, because we just said that according to Beis Shammai, they would have to each contribute their own bread. Those who say when do we say that there needs to be 5 breads? That was davka when the eruv was coming to them. Right? So I'm sorry. So when do we say that there's a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? That is when they were bringing the eruv to the mansion. Everyone else was bringing the eruv to the mansion. But if they were bringing the eruv from the mansion to one of the other places, even Beis Hillel would agree that each group would have to contribute an eruv, a loaf of bread. Kaman azla hadatanya. But then, who does the following brisa go like? Chamisha shegavos Ayruvin, that if you have a chutzner or 2 chutzers right next to each other and they want to make an eruv. Now, one of the chutzers made a eruv with all the 5 people in there contributed their bread. When they bring their eruv to the other chutzner, eruv echad lechulan, they really only have to bring 1 bread. They don't have to bring all 5. Kiman delo kechad. Well, then that's not like any of them. Meaning, according to the second way of understanding that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about 1 bread versus 5 breads is only when everybody else is bringing to the mansion. But if the mansion it would be bringing somewhere else, everyone would agree that even Beis Hillel would agree that they would have to come up with 5 loaves of bread, 1 for each group. Well, then there's brisa which says that when you have 2 chatzeres and one of them made an eruv, so they only have to bring 1 bread into the other eruv, into the other chutzner in order to make an eruv between the 2 chutzers. Well, then it's like neither Beis Shammai nor Beis Hillel. Nu Mishnah ha'achin shayu ochlin al shulchan avim. What if you have 2 children, 2 brothers, and they're still reliant on their father? Right, so they eat all their meals by their father. However, they have their own houses. So let's say you have a chutzner, and there are 5 houses in the chutzner. 1 of them belongs to the father. 2 of them belongs to each of the children respectively. And then there's another 2 houses that belong to random people. So now these children, so they eat by their father's house. Right, they're somech al shulchan avim, but they sleep in their own houses. So tzrichin eruv l'chol echad ve'echad. So each house is going to have to contribute an eruv, right? Each child is going to have to contribute to the communal eruv. Lefichach, therefore, im shachach echad man v'lo eruv, if one of them forgot and didn't contribute to the eruv, mevatel es v'shuso, he can just relinquish his rights so he relinquishes his rights to the chutzner in order to allow the other people to carry. A masai, when do we say that the children need to contribute to the communal eruv? That is only when they are bringing their eruv to a different house, right? So we said that there are 5 houses in the chutzner, 3 of them belong to this one family, then there's these 2 other random houses that belong to these other people. So if they're keeping the eruv in one of the other houses, well then the 2 children are also going to have to contribute, even though they're really relying just on their fathers and their father. So that avalim haya eruv ba'etzlan. But if the Eruv was coming to one of their houses, right? Let's say the Eruv was coming to their father, well then their father doesn't have to give them bread to contribute to the Eruv, right? Because after all, it's in his own house anyways. So then they wouldn't have to contribute to the Eruv. Or if they were the only ones in the Chatzar, right? So let's say there were only 3 houses in the Chatzar, and one of them was owned by the father, and then the other 2 were the children who are relying on the father financially anyways. So then they wouldn't have to make an Eruv. Let's hold it here. We'll pick up from the Gemara tomorrow. What did we talk about today? There was some pretty technical stuff today. We talked at the beginning about the machlokas between Reb Meir and the Chachamim regarding if you make an Eruv, a Shitufim Mevos, you also have to make an Eruv Chatzeros. There are 2 different ways of understanding that machlokas. One is that everyone agrees that by bread, if you made a Shitufim Mevos, you would not have to make an Eruv Chatzeros, but when it comes to wine, there is a machlokas. And the other way of understanding it is that when it comes to wine, everyone agrees that you would have to make a Shitufim Mevos and an Eruv Chatzeros, but when it comes to bread, that's where there's a machlokas between Reb Meir and the Chacham. Reb Meir would say you would still have to make a Shitufim Mevos and an Eruv Chatzeros, whereas the Chacham say it would work for both. When it comes to bread, they would say that it works for both. And then we got into this new Mishnah about these 5 people that are spending Shabbos in this mansion in these makeshift kind of areas. So we had 4 different ways of understanding what the wall between them could possibly look like. We had 2 opinions of Rav Nachman. One of them is that the machlokas is davka when the wall, machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is davka when the wall is less than 10 tefachim. If it's taller than 10 tefachim, however, then Beis Hillel would agree that everyone would have to contribute their own bread. The other way to understand Rav Nachman is that the machlokas is both when it's above 10 tefachim and when it's below 10 tefachim. Then we had the machlokas from Reb Chia as well as Reb Shimon bar Rebbe. One of the opinions was that the machlokas is dafka when the wall reaches the ceiling, but if the wall doesn't reach the ceiling, everyone agrees that you would only need one bread. And the other way to understanding it is that dafka when the wall reaches the ceiling, everyone agrees that you would have to bring separate breads, but if the wall doesn't reach the ceiling, that's where there is the machlokas. And then we spent about half of Amud Beis talking, about which we had the Bryce of Rabbi Yehuda Asabar, who says that the machlokas is davka when the wall doesn't reach the ceiling, and seeing if that disqualifies those 4 opinions that we had. And then we got to the new Mishnah about a father and children being in a chatzar. Cheva, that was Daf Ayin Beis of Masechta Ayruvin. Peace.